Hello, welcome to the special Chancellor Town Hall. My name is Danny McIntosh, and I'm the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and I'm happy to welcome you this afternoon. I want to thank all of you for joining the DU community, and I want to recognize a special guest in the audience, Dr. Rhonda Gonzalez, who will become the new Dean of College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and who is also a historian, is joining us today. Welcome, Dr. Gonzalez, and we look forward to being part of the DU family. As we begin, it's important to acknowledge that the University of Denver resides on land held in stewardship by the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. We recognize the descendant communities of the Northern Cheyenne tribe of Montana, the Northern Arapaho tribe of Wyoming, and the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma, who were forcibly, violently removed from this land. We also acknowledge the Southern Ute tribe and the Ute Mountain tribe, which are the only two federally recognized tribes in Colorado. Today, Denver is home to many different citizens of indigenous nations, and we recognize their enduring presence on this land by paying respect to their elders, both past and present. Let's please take a moment to consider the legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and resettlement that bring us together today, and please join us in uncovering the truths at all public events. Such an acknowledgement is especially appropriate as we reflect on how the past is relevant to understanding the present. It is because of the sacrifices and the hardships of the traditional indigenous inhabitants of this land that we're able to be here to learn, collaborate, and share knowledge. As history has shown, today's political polarization is not an anomaly. How these deep divides were addressed in the past can provide insight into the strategies to repair and work through such rifts today. We are excited to have author, journalist, and DU alumnus, David Von Drehle, with us today, as we take a closer look into one of the US's most revered historical figures, Abraham Lincoln. David's book, Rise to Greatness, references 1862 as America's most perilous year, a critical point in American history during which a resilient and determined leader was imperative. I'm looking forward to learning more about this subject from our panelists, but first, a few housekeeping items. You may submit questions for the panelists via the Q&A button on your screen, and I'll try our hardest to answer as many as we can. Now, I'm delighted to introduce today's panelists. David Von Drehle is a columnist for the Washington Post, where he writes about national affairs and politics. He joined the Post in 2017 after a decade at Time magazine, where he wrote more than 60 cover stories as editor-at-large. He's the author of a number of books, including the book we'll be discussing today, Rise to Greatness, Abraham Lincoln, and America's Most Perilous Year. David earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Denver, where he was also a Beecher Foundation Scholar and editor of the Clarion. In 1985, David graduated from Oxford University with a master's in literature as a Marshall Scholar. Our other panelist is Dr. Susan Schulten. She's a professor of US history at DU and has written A History of America in 100 Maps, Mapping the Nation, History and Cartography in the 19th Century America, and Geographical Imagination in America, 1880 to 1950. She is also the co-editor of Constructing the American Past, a source book of a people's history. She received her BA from UC Berkeley and her doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. Today's conversation will be moderated by Chancellor Jeremy Haefner. Dr. Haefner is the university's 19th chancellor, and he brings over 3 decades of leadership experience in higher education to DU. Named chancellor in 2019, Dr. Haefner seeks to continue and accelerate the momentum in the DU community. He strongly believes DU is an institution uniquely able to serve students as they prepare for lives of purpose and careers of fulfillment, all while serving the public good. Indeed, he believes the DU can and must excel in providing a student experience unlike any other university. He sees limitless potential and talent in DU's faculty and knows the research will further the creation of knowledge and serve the public good. As Chancellor, Jeremy energetically supports the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and he'll continue to build on DU's long legacy and relentless innovation and ethical leadership. And his creation and moderation of this panel is one example of the work that Jeremy has done. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Haefner.
Well, thank you, Danny, for that very wonderful and warm introduction, and of the introductions of our special guests here, David Von Drehle and Susan Schulten. I want to simply add that David is also, on top of all the other wonderful things he's accomplished, our 2022 commencement speaker. And so we're delighted to have this kind of prelude for his ultimate event when we celebrate commencement later in the following year. Of course, we're in the midst of commencement during our 2021 class as well. And kudos to Dean Danny McIntosh, who wraps up, of course, an illustrious career as Dean of the Arts, Humanities, and Social Science College here at the University of Denver. Danny, I want to just publicly thank you for the incredible work that you've done, the transformations that you've led, both at the college level and at the university. We will miss your leadership, but are heartened to know that you're still a member of our community and a great faculty member as well.
Thank you, Jeremy.
I am absolutely tickled, crimson and gold, about this upcoming conversation that we have. And as I was telling both David and Susan, I feel a little guilty because of my excitement, enthusiasm for the topic, and of course, engaging two of our most incredible scholars on this particular topic. I am going to start, you heard from Dean McIntosh a bit about why 1862, and of course we're going to hear more about that, but the title of the presentation really is Lincoln on a Tightrope, and we're going to start with that metaphor. Why a tightrope? And I'm going to read from some of David's writings on this very topic. So if you will, stay with me. In the summer of 1862, in response to pressures by abolitionists, Lincoln recalled a tightrope walker, the great Blondin, walking across Niagara Falls. To Lincoln, this daring and delicate act was a metaphor of his own position. Lincoln painted a picture for the group. Quote, suppose all the material values of this great country, its wealth, its prosperity, its achievements, could all have been concentrated and given to Blondin to carry over that awful crossing. Suppose, Lincoln went on, you had been standing upon the shore as he was going over, as he was carefully feeling his way along and balancing his pole with all his most delicate skill over the thundering cataract. Would you have shouted at him, Blondin, a step to the right, Blondin, a step to the left? Or would you have stood there, speechless, and held your breath and prayed to the Almighty to guide and help him safely through the trial? So, David and Susan, what I'd like to start with is what were the forces that were pulling Lincoln, pulling to the left of the tightrope, to the right of the tightrope that he had to walk?
Well, I'll take a first stab at that. And Chancellor Haefner, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great honor. It's always a pleasure to be involved in anything at the University of Denver. One of the most important institutions, not only in my life, but in the life of my family. My mother was a longtime staff member at DU, and my older sister Lynn is a proud graduate, and I as well. We owe so much to the university. Lincoln entered this horrible period understanding one thing, which was that his only chance of success was to hold together a coalition in the North that was divided on most issues and had only really one thing bringing them together, which was the idea that the South should not be able to break up the United States because they had lost the presidential election of 1860 and saw in that a portent of ultimately losing their power over the Congress through their advantages in the Senate. And they understood or they believed that in the long term, that would lead to the destruction of their peculiar institution, as they called it, of slavery. Lincoln believed that saving the Union would ultimately lead to an end to slavery. He said that a number of times in the 1850s, but he didn't believe that the presidency gave him the power to do away with slavery himself. He understood that the Supreme Court was still dominated by the same Chief Justice Roger Taney, who had written the Dred Scott decision that really had done so much to create this crisis. He understood that if he put himself in a position where Roger Taney could hold his actions to be unconstitutional, that would severely damage the appeal that he had to the what you might call the conservative democratic unionists of the North. These were people who wanted to save the Union, but really didn't believe that slavery needed to be dealt with, let alone abolished immediately. But at the same time, he had to hold the other half of his coalition, what we might call in modern terms, the step to the left. These were the abolitionists who didn't believe that the Union was worth saving unless slavery was abolished as well. That to save the Union and preserve slavery would be an abomination, and they had no interest in that. So you had these two sides, we could call them in modern terms, a right and a left, a more conservative, a more progressive wing, and he was balancing them, the ones who didn't want to take on slavery, the ones who insisted on taking on slavery, and he had to hold them. And he kept using all through this delicate year that led up to his dramatic action of the Emancipation Proclamation at the end of the year. He always used these balancing metaphors. He speaks of the tightrope. Later in the year, he keeps a conservative member of the cabinet and a more progressive member of the cabinet who were in conflict. He keeps them both in office when both of them were talking about resigning. And he says, now I have a pumpkin in each end of my bag, I can ride. You know, it is, again, this balancing, constantly thinking of himself as holding these two competing forces together. And I realized when I was thanking people at the beginning that I failed to thank my co-panelists. Susan is, to me, one of the most interesting and exciting historians working today. Her compelling way of talking about the importance of geography to history is so interesting and so right, and puts me in mind of another figure from this period, Ambrose Bierce, the famous writer, who once said that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Susan, I'll kick it to you to add your thoughts here.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
I think the tightrope metaphor is really useful. And what I'll add is that Lincoln has a tightrope in his own mind. And that is a man who is deeply, deeply loyal to this idea of union. And some of my students ask that, what is so important to him about this idea of union? And what that does is to give him a very clear internal sense of his own limits as commander-in-chief. So on top of the fact that he's being enormously pressured by abolitionists, I think of Frederick Douglass, who says, now is the time. Slavery is the stomach of the South. Strike now. What's holding you back? And then, of course, the conservative Democrats who would absolutely defect if he began to fight against slavery as an institution. On top of that, he's got in his own head a very, very bounded sense of what the Constitution allows him to do. That will evolve, of course, as the war goes more poorly. But as he enters 1862, he's quite aware that he doesn't necessarily have the power to strike slavery where it is. He must focus on the future of slavery in the West. And that's what keeps him so deeply engaged with the war.
You both talked about Lincoln's perception of the North and it being polarized into the abolitionists and the more conservative but wanting to keep the Union together. So Susan, I'm going to turn to you and reverse that question. Really, how did the Northerners really over the year of 1862 come to visualize and think of Lincoln? Because clearly they saw him balancing, clearly they saw him struggling with the limitations of his power. So I'm interested in knowing what you think the Northerners thought of Lincoln.
That's where I think it's important for us to remember that this isn't simply a war of North versus South. Within the South, there's tremendous diversity of opinion about the constitutionality of secession or the wisdom of secession. And of course, remember that 3 states defeated secession before they joined the Confederacy, and 4 states remained with the Union. So that complicates the South. The North, I think, has an even greater range of opinion. You have abolitionists, people like Douglas, who are pushing Lincoln as hard as possible. And Douglas has his allies within Congress. Congress is way ahead, if you will, of Lincoln in terms of giving the military the power to confiscate slaves. But you also have folks, particularly in places like Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, all through Ohio, who believe deeply that preserving the Union means preserving the rights to slavery, and who are watching Lincoln like a hawk and are absolutely ready to revoke their support for the war if he oversteps on slavery. So within the North, there's this tremendous diversity of opinion. And as David said, what binds people together at the beginning of '62 is the defeat of the rebellion. On that, they have common ground. But how to defeat the rebellion? That's where there's an enormous disagreement.
David, what about the South? Let's just pick up on this theme. Susan mentioned the diversity in the South here. And maybe help the audience just understand a little bit of the diversity of the thought in the South and what was pulling it apart at the same time as keeping it together.
Sure, and I'll take a stab, maybe overly boldly, at Susan's expertise and talk a little bit about the geography of the South. We think of it as one place, maybe a kind of gone with the wind land of rolling fields and big plantation houses and so forth. But it is now and was then very geographically diverse, and the diversity of the geography created diversity of thought. You did have the deep South of the large plantations in South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama. These were societies really dominated by, and Virginia, an old aristocracy, really. Hereditary families passing down large fortunes, primarily based in land and slaves. It was very reminiscent of old Europe. And as a result, had always had a tension with the more industrialized North, which saw itself as not recreating an aristocracy, but still in rebellion against an aristocracy. Then you have the Appalachian mountain chain, which was never amenable to large plantation farming. And here you had through Western Virginia, Eastern Tennessee, and even into Northern Georgia, where across that mountain chain, a lot of resentment by people who felt like they were being taken into war by an aristocracy that did not have their interests at heart. There was talk in the Confederate Army a lot of complaint, because that was, again, be careful of the romance about, the Gone with the Wind South. The Confederate conscription, the draft in the South, was by far the most strict, aggressive, non-voluntary conscription that the American continent has ever seen. And so you had a lot of soldiers complaining about what they called a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And then, of course, you had Texas. Texas had been in the Union for about 25 years after having been an independent republic. And there were still a lot of Texans who thought that was a bad idea. And so they were in the Confederacy, but nobody necessarily thought that Texas was going to be a long-term member of a Confederate United States after the war. This is a point, I'll just toss it in briefly, that is really lost and when we talk about the Civil War. And Susan talked about why was Union so important to Lincoln. I have a couple of thoughts on that, but one of them is really nobody at that time felt like the North and the South were stable, long-term nations, and that there could be a peaceful separation and then two stable countries. Everybody felt that once secession got started, it could bite in every direction. And that New England, which, as Susan said, had nothing in common with a lot of the Midwest, they would naturally split, that the Confederacy would split in ways that I've been referencing, and certainly that the far West, California at that time, you had to take a 3 or 4, 5, 6 week boat trip around the Cape to get to California. There wasn't even a transcontinental railroad. You could go by stagecoach. So the idea that California would stay connected to Washington, D.C. somehow in a long-term stable relationship. No, the North American continent would split up just like Europe had split up, and that the Civil War would be the first war in an endless chain of wars, just as Europe had been riven by war for century after century after century. So this is part of the reason that Lincoln felt it was important to hold it together, because this would be the first fight, not the last fight otherwise.
And I would guess, and I'm going to turn to Susan here in just a minute, because to have her add any other color to the geography issue here, but you also had England and France really quite interested in knowing what the heck was going on in the United States, and they were probably chomping at the bit to be a major player in whatever turned out, if it went the other way, and secession was the likelihood. Susan, any geography rebuttal there on that one? What David added?
I'll just say that there's an old cliche, and forgive me, but it does help us. It particularly resonates with students, is that the idea was, when you think about Western expansion, and I think we need to keep our eye on the West here, particularly as it relates not just to this idea of manifest destiny, but the implications it has for Native nations. The idea was in the 1840s and 50s that the West was the child that the North and South had to keep the marriage together. And in fact, the West was the child that tore the marriage apart. And I know that that's simplistic, but it really reminds us that what is at stake here is not slavery in the South. That's not what most Northerners care about. What they care about is the future of the nation and whether slavery will extend into the West. Right. And that may feel to us a little bit opportunistic and almost amoral, but it's the future of slavery that galvanizes most Northerners to join the Republican Party, including Lincoln. And that reminds us of the central place that where we live here in Colorado, the central place that plays, because that's the future of the country. And of course, the implications for slavery in the West have everything to do with the implications for the nation as a whole and what kind of nation it will be.
That's absolutely right. I now live in Kansas City on the border of Missouri and Kansas. I can almost throw a baseball from here in Kansas to my neighbors in Missouri. And there's a road that a few blocks from here called State Line Road. The dotted line down the middle of the road is the border, was the border in the late 1850s between a slave state, Missouri, and a free state, Kansas. People talk about the war starting at Fort Sumter in 1860. No, it started in right here in northeastern Kansas in 1856, when Americans were raising armies and shooting at each other and killing each other over the question of whether Kansas would come into the nation with a free constitution or a slave constitution. That's what really galvanized Lincoln to restart his political career, which had kind of fizzled out in the early 1850s. And he saw, as so many people, Susan says, that as he talks about in 1862, you can draw a line east of the Mississippi that could divide us slave and free. It's called the Ohio River Valley, basically. You could do that, but in the West, the lines between states are just creations of surveyors. They're just imaginary lines, and you can step from one to the other. And it's not sustainable to have a country where a person could be lawfully enslaved on one side of the room or one side of a street and cross the street and be a free citizen. That's not sustainable. And so this is such a key point that Susan made. It is the West that creates the Civil War. What's the fate of the West?
Wow, this is really fascinating. Just because we started off kind of struggling with where was slavery as the core piece of the Civil War in the first place, and then the conversation turned to keeping the Union together, and then now it turns back to slavery, but viewed from a geographic lens of the West. Is there, so what at the end of the day is the West the right lens by which to look at the Civil War and creating all the polarizations? Are there other ones that you want to throw out there as well?
I think that when you're looking at the road to the Civil War, you're right, Jeremy, there's so many different lenses through which to look at this. And historians have focused on, is there an ethnic component? In other words, can we look back at the settlement of these colonies and see different cultures seated in this 18th century? Is it better to look primarily at economics? Is it better to primarily look at partisan divisions and the outcomes in the 1860 Electoral College? To me, what's most useful is to look at the country and see that it's moving in two different directions. And I'm again going to oversimplify, but in the South, you have a society that is doubling down on enslavement. And that you can see in the frontier that David talked about, the explosion of cotton in Alabama, in Mississippi, and of course in East Texas. That is for the South, the future. Even though Virginia is slightly moving away from slavery for economic reasons, they see that for them to sustain what makes the South unique demands growth into the frontier. It demands new land. So they've got their eye on further and further boundaries in the West. Northerners are looking at a different kind of future. One statistic that I found so powerful is that from 1840 to 1860, there were about 4 million immigrants to this country, chiefly from Ireland and Germany. And where do they go? They don't go to any of the slave states. There's no opportunity for them there. And the fact that they're coming in such huge numbers to northern states for land and for work only furthers a movement toward an industrial future. So in other words, it's not as though there is this thing called the North and the South, but there are two different societies moving in different trajectories. And those differences. We can talk about the moral problems of slavery too, but even for those who are indifferent to slavery, their futures are going in different directions, if that's useful. So that's another way to think about two societies hurtling in different directions.
Nice, wonderful. So we've been kind of talking about, of course, the balancing act, which, you know, in almost every casual observer would say, there's probably parallels to the world we live in today. And we're not going to quite go down that path, at least right now. I want to stay with 1862. And I'm going to ask David now, you know, I guess number one, you know, why did he choose 1862? Number two, talk to us about the public perception at the beginning of the year, and what was the landscape and how people perceived the situation. And then fast forward all the way to December 31st at the end of the year, and what was the public perception at that point in time?
It was fascinating to me. I chose 1862 really after reading David Herbert Donald's biography of Lincoln, which is not my favorite one volume, but it's a good one. And but I got to the end of the year 1862 in that book, and I stopped and literally thought to myself, how did he survive? A personal question. The strains are enormous. His son, William, who everybody said was the most like his father and his father's favorite, died in February of 1862 after a terrible disease that his father watched, you know, the son waste away in the White House. He had that grief. Mrs. Lincoln had a nervous breakdown after Willie died. So he had that on his plate, and he had this issue of he's on this tightrope, and then he's fighting through the whole year against a very powerful general who he's placed in charge of the Union Army, George McClellan, who his Republican colleagues all believe is secretly in league with the South, that the general in charge of the Union Army is secretly a traitor and has a deal with the South to drag this out so long that basically Southern independence becomes a fait accompli. So he's dealing with all of that, and that seemed so compelling to me. And then I realized as I got into the research that our common understanding of the war is kind of wrong. That looking backward, people say, well, of course the North won. The North had all the factories, the North had all the people, the North had all the money, the North had this, had that. No, at the beginning of 1862, every knowledgeable independent observer, the most skilled statesmen of Europe, all looked at this situation and said, there is no way the North can subdue the South. The entire United States Army at the beginning of the war was 16,000 people, and a large number of them went with the South. There was not a single general in the United States Army at the beginning of 1862 who had ever led 1,000 men in combat, let alone the largest armies that the world had ever seen. The extent of the Southern nation, if we call it that, was larger than the landmass, the entire European landmass conquered by Napoleon, the greatest general of the 19th century up to that point. And the idea that this unschooled, this frontier lawyer who had never been to elementary school, let alone to college, who had never, his entire military experience was 2 weeks in the state militia, as a young man, where he said the only blood he saw spilled was to mosquitoes, that he would be able to somehow raise a volunteer army and conquer a greater expanse than Napoleon. This was crazy. It could never happen. You go through to the end of the year, he's announced his Emancipation Proclamation. He's taken this core thorny issue and finally grasped the nettle. And the off-year elections have happened. And yeah, it was a pretty good election for the Democrats, but when the smoke cleared, Lincoln still, he was in office. The Republicans still had a majority of the generals, or of the governors rather. They still had the House and the Senate. And so he still was in political control. He had survived this most divisive issue, and he had control of the army as well. The Southerners had gone into the border states in the fall of 1862, believing that Kentuckians and Marylanders would rally to the cause of the South. And no, it didn't work that way. They weren't welcomed, and they were soundly defeated in two key battles at Antietam in Maryland and at Perryville in Kentucky, and they had turned around and retreated. So all the things that might have brought about the crisis. And lastly, Lincoln's foreign policy had been successful, and the European powers had not tried to intervene on the side of the South. So all the ideas that the Southerners had for victory, number one, that the Europeans would come in and decide it for them. Number two, that the Northern political union would splinter and Lincoln would lose power. Or three, that the border states would rise up and welcome their Southern liberators. All three of those strategies were dead by the end of 1862. And they really didn't have anything else besides just a tremendously fierce desire to fight to the end. And so a lot of blood was shed between January 1863 and the end of the war, a tremendous amount of blood, but it was in a desperately hopeless cause at that point.
That's fascinating and so rich to understand those factors that were going on. Many of them were directly impacting Lincoln, from the death of Willie, the problem with the generals, and of course the tensions that he had to knit together to keep the Union all in one piece. I think what we should do now is pivot to Lincoln himself and dive into the man and the myth, quite frankly. And I'm going to really raise the question about his views on slavery. And this one's, let's start with Susan on this one. David just did a really nice job at laying out the kind of the shrewdness, the political savviness that Lincoln must have deployed in order to get from January of 1862 to December 1862 in such a really a successful way. You told me when we were doing a little planning session about a fascinating story that described Lincoln's response to a prominent journalist calling for him to make a bold stance on slavery. So maybe that's a great way to start helping the audience understand Lincoln's complex views of slavery. So what was his response, and why would that matter as we look at this situation?
Yeah, it's a great one, and it's sort of the heart of the matter when students really have to confront this individual. I think the main thing to keep in mind is, as David said, how badly the war was going in early 1862. We forget that because we project the end onto the beginning. But Lincoln has no strength in early 1862, and he's desperately urging his generals to move forward. And yet the Union Army had yet to invade the South at the beginning of 62. This is, 6 or 8 months after Fort Sumter. So he's coming into 1862 with not a lot of power. And I mean that in the sense of not a lot of credibility on which to move against slavery. And he knows that. He spends much of the summer, and this is something that I think David's book really does justice to. He courts the border states with compensated emancipation. I'll pay you to liberate your slaves. And they say, no, thank you. He courts Black leaders with the rather shocking proposal to have them go back to Africa, which is horrifying to us today, but it's crucial that we recognize that this was on Lincoln's radar. He pushes a plan of what he calls colonization. So both of those plans fail. And that is part, along with the failure of the military in Virginia and the failure of McClellan to take Richmond, that forces Lincoln to think differently about slavery. And that conversion that he undergoes, David points to kind of June, I think, is a crucial month where something's happening to Lincoln, where his anti-slavery views are finally lining up with his imperatives as a commander-in-chief. But the anecdote you're speaking of is crucial, that in the middle of August, Horace Greeley, who owns the New York Herald and is a very, very powerful public figure, his columns go out kind of in syndication all over the country. He's a very influential voice. He says to Lincoln, essentially, what the hell are you waiting for? You have to move on slavery. He's pushing as hard as he can, along with abolitionists. And he makes that statement public. It's printed in many Northern newspapers. And so Lincoln 3 days later responds with a public letter of his own. And the crucial passage that I think students find so difficult to wrap their head around is this. He says, I have never changed my views on slavery. Slavery is wrong. But if I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. What I do with slavery is about what I do for the Union. The Union is the paramount goal here. Now, some students look at that and are horrified. This looks like a guy who is willing to save the idea of the Union, even if at the expense of racial justice. And other students say, no, this is a guy who is being extremely savvy. And the way that that works is, if you think about the timing, Lincoln has already drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. In other words, he's making this public pronouncement when he's already decided to attack slavery. He's already revealed it to his cabinet. And yet he knows that he must prepare the public for this. And the letter, as offensive as it is to our own ears, is his way of preparing the public. He's already decided. And so you can see Lincoln in different ways according to that letter. David, I don't know if you'd like to elaborate or maybe challenge that.
No, not at all. It's I wish I'd had a transcript because I think you put the case more clearly than I do in the book. It is a purely political message to prepare the North, as Susan says, for this, what he knew was going to be a very controversial act when he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He was waiting for a Union victory to issue the proclamation, to make that announcement, so that it wouldn't look like a last desperate measure of a defeated nation. And so he had this excruciating period where he knew what he was going to do, but he couldn't say it, while he waited for George McClellan finally to engage Lee at the Battle of Antietam in September. And then immediately after that, he announced the proclamation. So what he did was he took that opportunity with the spotlight on him to tell the North, which, remember, is comprised of people who hate slavery and people who are perfectly happy to see it go on. He tells them, whatever I do, hint, hint, here's why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because of the one thing we all agree on, union. I'm doing it. It's going to seem like I'm dividing us, but really I'm holding us together because I'm for the Union. This is the one thing they agree on. And so he takes this opportunity, highly public opportunity. This is a year where he says almost nothing. He gives very few speeches. When people pressure him for speeches, he'll say, well, I'm not going to talk much because I'll only get in trouble. He's so careful with every word, and yet here's this explosive announcement, this public letter, and he's saying, if I have to deal with slavery, it's going to be to save the Union. Remember that. I'm trying to bring us together. I mean, to put it in more modern terms, I'm a uniter, not a divider.
And Jeremy, can I throw out a tougher question here on this note?
Please.
And we don't have to answer it, but there's a harder kind of rub here, and that is Lincoln leading or is Lincoln following? And there are ways to answer that, right? Different ways, but it really goes to the heart of the matter, because Congress is pushed way past him on this issue of confiscating slaves in the South. The related question is, does he deserve to be called the Great Emancipator, right? And those are two deceptively simple questions. Is he leading or following? And is he really the Great Emancipator? That I think bring out the real issues, because we have valorized him for lots of reasons. On closer scrutiny, it's a lot more complicated, but we don't know what might have been, because what we have is the record.
That's a great question. I want to take a stab at it by again describing what a incredible year this was, and how it resonates down to this day. When Abraham Lincoln took office, the presidency was arguably the least powerful branch of the government. The federal government was tiny compared to what we have today. The entire federal budget of 1860 was $80 million, or divide that by 12, less than $10 million a month for the entire federal budget. The President of the United States had in his budget one secretary. That was the only employee that the president had. When Lincoln came to Washington and felt he needed a second secretary, he had to take money from the Interior Department to pay his second secretary. This is to try to picture what a small office this is. There was a constitutional concept that the president was commander-in-chief, but nobody knew what that meant. This was the first time a president was able to communicate with an army once they'd marched out of sort of shouting distance to them. And so Lincoln is really creating the modern presidency. Now, who ran the government before the Civil War? Congress ran the government before the Civil War. So the notion that the president leads and the Congress follows, that is so, so modern, so important to our understanding of how the government works. That was not America in 1860. Lincoln was creating this strong presidency. There was no precedent for an act as as bold and authoritative as the Emancipation Proclamation. So I think that's relevant. We can't take Franklin Roosevelt's presidency or the imperial presidency that we have today and project it back on the early Lincoln administration, because in many ways, I won't call it a ceremonial office, but it was very much a small executive office with, as I say, no employees, no serious budget, so that's relevant. There's also, in terms of Lincoln's own conception of himself, he did not see himself as an anti-slavery leader. He knew and respected the anti-slavery leaders. But he spoke once of Charles Sumner, one of the most important abolitionist political figures in American history, a lion of the Senate at that time. He said, "I am so far behind the Sumner Lighthouse on this issue." He was personally opposed to slavery. He did not believe that white and Black Americans could live happily and productively together. He couldn't picture that. And I think in ways he was prophetic on that. I think he understood more than some people just how difficult an issue race would continue to be, unfortunately, that we're still dealing with it in difficult, painful ways. 150 years later, wouldn't have surprised Lincoln one bit. So he was not leading on that. And he didn't have an illusion either that he was in control of events. This is the last thing. He frequently said, "I am just trying to get from one day to the next. I'm not sure where this is going." Walt Whitman, who moved to Washington at the end of 1862, he famously eulogized Lincoln after his death in one of our most famous poems that starts, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." And this is such a perfect metaphor. A captain on a storm-tossed ship. He doesn't control the waves. He doesn't control the winds. He doesn't control the tides. All he can do is try to steer the ship safely through the storm. And that's the way Lincoln envisioned his leadership, that he was holding the thing together while God controlled the storm.
All right, I got to hear from Susan now, how she would answer her own question. Was he following? Was he leading? Does he deserve the great emancipator?
On the Great Emancipator, no. I mean, he doesn't go much further than the Second Confiscation Act. But it makes sense for us to explore why folks revered him as the Great Emancipator at the time. Frederick Douglass famously eulogized Lincoln as the white man's president, but a great president nonetheless. In other words, he represented the interests of white America in wanting to liberate the country from slavery, as opposed to really having an interest in the rights and the futures of Black Americans. So that's a tough one, right? There's a reason I teach an entire seminar on Lincoln, and that's not because I find him some extraordinary hero, but I find it endlessly fascinating to think about the country through his eyes. Because for me, he is best seen as a kind of evolution of Americans themselves. Mm-hmm. That is to say, in 1861, he wants to preserve the Union as it is. A year later, he sees that the only way to preserve the Union is to remake it by destroying slavery. It's that conversion that is so important for us to reckon with, as he puts it, a more perfect union. There's one more thing I want to throw out there, and forgive me that it's so late in the hour, but it's something that really haunts me. And that is, of course, Lincoln is laser focused on the South and defeating the Confederacy. But all through the war, there are enormous transformations happening in the West, through the Land Grant Act, through the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Act. The Republican Party is remaking the West in its image. And there's enormous migration in the 50s and then an explosion of migration thereafter. And one of the consequences of that is the massive dislocation of Native Americans. And so we celebrate December 1862 and January of 1863 as the moments in which the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. But the day after Christmas is also the day that Lincoln authorizes the largest mass execution in American history, in the Dakota Uprising, the execution of 38 Sioux men. Now, that number was originally supposed to be 300. 300 men were to be hanged for that uprising and the attacks on settlers in Minnesota. Lincoln goes through every one of those cases and reduces the number to about 38. So in some ways, historians have said this is one of the greatest acts of clemency in our history. And it happens, what, 4 days before the Emancipation Proclamation? But in another way, we have to step back and look at those forces that David talked about. Why was there an uprising in the Sioux territory? Why were those men so desperate? And of course, that's the larger structural problem that we have to reckon with in America, that the West that we were fighting over, right, was a West that had people who were profoundly dislocated by the war, right? And that's another way to think about the Civil War that we're not really used to, but it forces us to bring our own location. And it also helps to explain, of course, the tragedy at Sand Creek.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It's no coincidence that that army that is created and those generals that are made by the Civil War turn out to be the ones who finish the job of stealing this country from its indigenous peoples. William Sherman, Phil Sheridan leap out, but Custer, all of the generals that we think of as we used to talk about as the Indian fighters, they were all veterans of the Civil War. That's how that's what the United States did with the military power that was created by the Civil War. And as Susan points out, all these laws were passed in 1862. So while they were struggling with all the rest of this, they were putting into place their plan for this land that they were at that moment taking from the previous inhabitants, the people who had it for centuries. And so it's such a dynamic point. All of it, I love this year, this horrible, terrible year, because so much of our future is wrapped up in it. And it's a great example of a place where knowing history makes us better citizens of our own time, to understand where these things come from and why they remain as painful as they are.
Now, normally I would say, wow, that is such a great way to wrap this up. But there is a question from the audience, and I can't resist putting it out there. And it's so relevant, Susan, to the Native American question that you just brought up, right? I'm thinking of the recent Board of Education in San Francisco decision to remove very famous names from a variety of different schools in that district. And one of them was Lincoln. And my understanding of a major reason why was his sense of values and treatment of the Native Americans. The question then that was posed is the following. Do you think that Lincoln is in danger of being canceled because of the modern lens of his views and his apparent values?
Oh boy, this is an enormous issue. It really bedeviled my students in fall with Civil War, when so many of those monuments and memorials are coming down, including the Abraham Lincoln statue that was first, which is just off the Capitol. Mm-hmm. The funds for which were raised by a former slave, but it is seen as too patronizing and not doing justice to Black self-liberation. So it's complicated. I think London Breed, the mayor of San Francisco, said it best when she hoped that the Board of Supervisors would help reopen the schools rather than worrying about what the schools were named. But I recognize that doesn't answer the question. What I hope to come out of this moment of reckoning is a greater scrutiny of the past, maybe not a prosecution, but a greater interrogation and exploration, because we can't escape it. Lincoln said that himself. We cannot escape history. We are the descendants of it. And so I'm dodging the question in some ways. I understand the spirit behind wanting to remove Lincoln's name. I also understand that it does a disservice to the context of the time. And I hope that that's satisfactory.
David, would you like to add anything as well?
That's so beautifully put. I would only add that Lincoln was never more hated than he was at the time. We cannot possibly hate him more than he was hated in his own lifetime. And certainly we can't hate him more than the lost cause Southerners have hated him for 150 years since then. And yet he's always managed to make his own case. And so he doesn't need me to make the case for him. But I would urge anybody who wants to meet a interesting, complicated, brilliant, tortured, complex human being and try to understand them in dramatic times, go look at Lincoln and form your own opinion.
Perfectly said. Well, it's my honor to wrap this up. And I find words coming from my voice insufficient to really summarize by any means, but I do take away a couple of things. Number one is history matters. It matters deeply. And in a time when our own country right now is experiencing tremendous polarization, it behooves us to always put in context our historical stories, narratives, facts, and figures. The second thing is, for those of you in the audience, if you had any doubts about a liberal education, those should be dispelled now, because you saw a liberal education at its finest in this last hour. You saw it, and to the third point, a tremendous pride that we have at this university, which honors and respects the liberal education in such a dramatic way by producing a fabulous alum who has gone on and made a tremendous career and really enabled so many of us to be thoughtful and critical thinkers through his work.
Thank you.
You have also an amazing faculty member and scholar who has clearly demonstrated not only the passion around what she brings through her research and scholarly work, but the passion that she has at transferring that to her students. So here at the University of Denver, I think we are proud that we've got great historians here, that we've produced great alums, and that we value so deeply a liberal education. So on behalf of all of us, David, thank you. Susan, thank you very much. And with that, I say goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.